Hello, my name is Tom Boyer. 1994, I was chief engineer for Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission and was asked to go to Newfoundland to retrieve two of the cannons that you see sitting behind me. In 1994, part of my duties was, as chief engineer, was to supervise our engineering and renovation program for state parks, as well as being a authorized contract person by which I could sign contracts and obligate state money for construction projects. So I was sent to Naval Facility, U.S. Naval Facility, Argentia, Newfoundland, with intentions of hiring a contractor to dismantle and ship two of the guns you see in the background from Newfoundland all the way across Canada and down here to Fort Columbia State Park on the Columbia River. As I mentioned earlier, these two guns were located at U.S. Navy Facility Argentia, Newfoundland. They were originally established there, I guess you would say, as part of a coastal defense on the Atlantic Ocean during World War II to protect the eastern seaboard, particularly in the northern Atlantic, from German U-boats and other kinds of German activity. The Navy base was actually a naval air station, and it was decommissioned, I believe, in about the 1970s, but remained as a naval facility on the island of Newfoundland until it was decommissioned in late 1990s, certainly after 94, which is when we acquired these two guns. They were put up by the U.S. Navy as historic artifacts for display, and our historian at the time for state parks was Dave Hansen, and he was able to negotiate the transfer of these guns from the U.S. Navy to our facility here at Fort Columbia State Park. As I mentioned, I went back on two trips. One was to go and devise a ways by which we could dismantle these guns and ship them across the United States, and to find a contractor who could do the work for us, negotiate a contract and sign a contract obligating state funds, Washington state funds, for a purchase, not purchase, but for the construction of dismantling of these guns and shipping them across Canada. As it turned out, I was also a Naval Reserve officer in the Civil Engineer Corps, and the Naval Facility Command there at Argentia was a Navy Civil Engineer Corps base, and I was able to make contact with U.S. Navy Civil Engineer Corps officers, and they helped me find a contractor that they had used who was reliable and could do the work that we had at hand. So that was on my first trip. My second trip, we went back, and with that contractor in hand, we dismantled these two guns, crated them up onto a flatbed truck, hauled them off the mountainside where they were located, and brought them into the town of St. John's, Newfoundland, from which it was then shipped by train all across the Canadian continent, country, all the way to the just north of Seattle area, and then it was put onto U.S. trains and shipped down to Longview, Washington, where we had an arrangement with several longshoremen unions. They offloaded these things at no cost. It was a volunteer project for them. They thought it was an interesting project, so they offloaded the parts and pieces of these guns, and then we had a contractor there with a flatbed truck who hauled them up here and put them in place. Now, each of these guns weighs 14 tons. The barbette shell that's around the gun, excuse me, weighs about 7 tons, and the gun itself weighs about 7 tons. So it was not, it took special equipment to dismantle and load them up and ship them out here. As you can see, this is quite a remarkable view for the park. And these guns, their purpose was to provide invasion protection of the mouth of the Columbia River, which is straight ahead out there. And maybe you can see the breakers if I zoom out. But these guns were never fired here. I do not believe they were fired in Newfoundland either. They date from the early 1900s. Each of these guns weigh, as I remember, about 44 tons. And the turret comes, or actually the gun slides out from the back end of the turret, and the gun weighs 22 tons. The turret weighs 22 tons. They're mounted on a track that can rotate around. I'll show you the track here. You can see how it rotates around inside here so that it can traverse and raise and lower the gun barrel. One of the other people instrumental in getting this gun here was Dave Hansen, who is quite knowledgeable on coastal artillery pieces. I don't know the size of the gun, but it's pretty large caliber. As at the bunker where this came from in Newfoundland, the bunker was right directly behind the gun, where they would roll out the shells and the artillery powder and pack it inside the weapon. Here's a interpretive sign here. I'm not going to zoom in on this. This is all something you can see when you're here at the site, but I will zoom in on this one part. Here is a picture of the installation of the guns here at Fort Columbia. They arrived on these flatbed trucks, and we had a rather substantial crane available or necessary to lift the guns and put them in place. And they were shipped pretty much across Canada. You can see perhaps on the photo there, you can see how they came on the flatbed truck, all mounted up like the cannon there. And that's essentially how it was put onto the train in Newfoundland and shipped here. So when we went to dismount these guns in Newfoundland, I was sent back there with a check and found a contractor who could do the work. These were kind of located remotely around the corner on a hillside of the naval base. And I did not have contracting authority outside of Washington State, and certainly not outside the United States, but found a great contractor to work with. He had all the right equipment. And when we went to dismantle the guns, he had a large backhoe, and the guns, when they were inside in Newfoundland, actually had a pair of railroad tracks that the gun would roll on. As you can see here on the mount here, you can see it looks like railroad tracks. Were tracks in the other location that brought the gun straight back so they could pull it out of the turret and for some reason pull it out of the turret and relocate it or something. I'm not exactly sure, don't remember. But anyway, when we went to push the gun on the railroad tracks outside to push it out of the turret, the gun recoiled and squirted water and everything out of the barrel. And then when we got done pushing it back and pulling it out, the gun barrel came back to its original location. So the gun actually looked like it could have been probably re-oiled and could actually probably have fired a shell out of the thing. It was in such good shape. In the bunkers, remarkably like the ones that are here, you can kind of see the bunker out here in front of us where they had the spotters and the people calling in fire support from out here. They had bunkers similar to that in Newfoundland, and the people actually slept on station right in the bunkers. I don't know if our bunkers here, I remember being in them for a long time, but our bunkers may have the same kind of arrangement as what they had out there at Newfoundland, but they had living quarters underground right next to the guns. And I remember there were quite a few of the early 1900 style men's journals that were made out of porcelain, that were the floor mounted, and they came up the wall and they had bear claw or claw foot kinds of carvings in it. And when I was chief engineer at the time, I was also in the Navy Reserve, Civil Engineer Corps, Navy Reserve. And when I got back to the naval facility in Argentia, I coupled up with the Navy civil engineer officer there, as well as the CB group that they had. And they tore apart a lot of the old plumbing fixtures and stuff like that came out of the bunkers, and were to have packaged them up and shipped them out here to the fort here. I don't know if we ever got those. I kind of looked around for them, but I haven't found them. So the Navy Seabees were great help in getting these out here. The longshoremen, like I mentioned before, down in Long Beach, were very helpful. They provided free longshoremen support to get these guns off of the railroad cars and onto the trucks, heavy-duty trucks that loaded these up and shipped them up here to the fort. So here is a close-up view of what the bunkers would look like here at Fort Columbia, and they were pretty much like this in Argentia as well. There were obviously places for the powder and the shot shells for the guns, but then there was also a large barracks area that was associated with it, and the crews would stay out there in those barracks, and they had underground, in Argentia anyway, they had underground tunnels that ran between the guns and then from the barracks unit out to the guns themselves. So here in Fort Columbia, we have somewhat the same. Here's the entrances to our underground bunkers. And I was in these things once, probably shortly after the guns arrived here. I don't remember. It was set up mostly as the bunker for the governor and governor's staff. So it didn't, as I recall, did not have the World War II configuration for the soldier personnel that would man these guns. You can see there is some fairly recent electrical installations coming into the bunkers. That's PVC electrical conduit, so that was put in well after 1994. I do not think we had PVC conduit available in 1994. In terms again of the gun, the shell casing around it, I think it's called a barbette. That weighs about 7 tons. The gun itself weighs about 7 tons. Interesting, the plug in the end of the barrel is actually a shell turned backwards and welded onto it to close off the barrel. And when we went to dismantle these guns in Argentia, the contractor had a large crane and was able to lift the barbette off and essentially slide it down over the barrel. And then they pushed on the barrel and tried to roll the gun down the tracks that it sits on. And as they did so, the barrel retracted in its recoil fashion. And there's quite a bit of water in the barrel and the recoil mechanism, which came squirting out. But the barrel then returned to its full position. And apparently, with some improvements, could actually be probably fired again. My recollection was wrong what I said before about how they dismantled this thing. They actually, you can see the tracks there. The tracks in Argentia came back quite a ways away from the turret area there. And they could actually, if I remember correctly, in Argentia, they could actually pull this gun back into a dug out into the cliff and put it into kind of a dry storage. So there was room for the contractor to take and push on the barrel of the gun. It would roll back across those railroad tracks back to an area that would be back in here, where he then was able to pick it up, set it on the flatbed truck, and then go in and dismantle the bolts around the turret and the shell, the barbette, and then pick it up and put it on another flatbed truck and haul it down off the mountainside. The turret that we have here was the original to Fort Columbia. And as I remember, that part of the gun there in Argentia remains there in Argentia, but everything else from the concrete level of steel turret, everything up from there came from Newfoundland out here to Fort Columbia. The inside, you can see the white painting there. Originally, that was a cork material, and it was meant to keep the condensation from dripping off the gun for one thing, and then also I think it was supposed to have had some kind of sound deafening, dampening effects for the gun crew working the gun. And I believe the paint that we have in there, I know the color scheme is accurate for the period based on David Hansen's work. And I think the white coating in there, if I remember correctly, we tried to put cork back in there, but we could not replicate it. So we just replicated the paint. So this gun is supposed to be able to rotate around. I don't know if the mechanisms are still inside that would rotate the thing, but you can tell it would have quite a commanding view of the mouth of the Columbia and up and down the entire seaboard end of the Columbia River. This was all part of what was shipped from Newfoundland all the way across the Canadian continent. Canadian country, I should probably call it. And like I mentioned before, when the contractor pushed on the barrel to try to move the whole gun assembly off its tracks, as the barrel came in to the chamber here, water was squirting out through all of these connections up around here. And I believe out through the breech door, which is back around here. So it was quite tight in terms of not being destroyed by the elements, having sat there for more than 50 years. And then once the gun was pushed out of place, then the barrel returned to its original position in much the same manner that it would after it would have been fired. The gun recoils when it fires, and the breech door then can be opened, new shell put in place, and the barrel returns to its extended position so it could be fired once again. All of the copper and brass, there were several pieces. I believe these are probably brass. They're probably painted over, but most of all the brass and copper pieces that were on the gun originally had been stolen years ago by vandals back in Newfoundland, not here at Fort Columbia. And the firing mechanism itself has been removed. So no chance of somebody trying to mess around with putting some kind of live round in there and touching the thing off. So not exactly sure what's underneath our deck plates here. I believe it's just the turning mechanism, what remains of the turning mechanism to rotate the gun, which might be manually operated, I'm not sure. In Argentia, I believe it had some kind of hydraulics or electrical associated with it. Not sure what they have here. Once again, barrel with a shell welded into the end of the barrel to plug it off. And that's basically what I recall about these guns and my involvement in it. I hope you found this to be interesting. I encourage you to take a closer look at the wartime history of Fort Columbia State Park and how these guns were initially program to be here as coastal defense and learn a little bit more about the history. There's another interpretive sign. Like I said, these guns were never fired, but nonetheless, they're here standing watch.